Good afternoon, and welcome into the Takeup. Today we have episode 189 Embroidery Fonts and Typefaces, Matches, Misses, and Making It Work. Hello, folks. Good afternoon, and welcome into the Takeup. Happy to have you here on this Education Friday, where we talk about all manner of things embroidery and decoration. So it's not just decoration. We talk about design, we talk about things related to it, but by and large, we stay here with the stitches, as you might guess. The thing is, I have been doing lots of work on fonts lately. As you may know, I do a lot of work with lettering and fonts, and honestly, with lots of people who I would consider personalizers. So maybe not always doing custom work, full custom digitizing, but doing a lot of personalization. And so I get lots of questions about fonts. And frankly, being somebody who's always been very interested in typefaces, so much so that you guys have seen me flash books, I've got books sitting next to me like Lupton's Thinking with Type, which also always reflects poorly, but here we are. I have type books within reach of me right now that are more in the graphic design world. I've been a type guy for a long time. Being that that's the case, a lot of people ask me questions about fonts and typography and stuff in general. And frankly, I tend to think that the basis of embroidery as a business, the most elemental form of embroidery as a business, really is about personalization, name dropping, monogramming. That I think is probably the most original and basic and elemental kind of version of what the embroidery business, the commercial embroidery business, looks like. So I talk about fonts a lot. So it's not going to be surprising whatsoever for you guys to have seen that as the channel thumbnail came up, you saw me talking about fonts again. I know sometimes people will be like, man, why do we always talk about fonts and lettering? Frankly, because I very much do think it is the basis for most everything else we do. If you can learn to apply fonts correctly, if you can learn the settings related to fonts and typefaces, and you can learn to tweak your embroidery, work on satin stitch fonts correctly, it is the basis for knowing everything else. Because as we always know, the stitch is the stitch. There is only one stitch. If we understand tension, if we understand pull compensation, if we understand stitch types, underlay, and the use of materials, we can make anything we want. Well, the basic, most elemental version of that in my mind has always been lettering. On top of that, as you know from what I put up as the channel cap here, what I wanted to talk about was matches, misses, near making it work, fonts and typefaces. Why is embroidery and why are embroidery fonts so difficult, especially for folks who are doing things that are multimedia, who are going across that spectrum of print to embroidery, who are working digital and embroidery both? Why is it so problematic? Why can't they find what they need? And what should we do about it? So this shouldn't be a super long, super detailed episode. I am going to share some stuff that I've been working on as well and talk about creating of fonts for embroidery, just because I think it also helps you to understand how your fonts work and how maybe different systems treat different fonts. But to understand what a font is, what a typeface is to a degree, talk about the world of embroidery and what that means, and then answer questions and talk about in general personalization and the technical side of this as well. So it's going to be a little bit of design, a little bit of embroidery, a little bit of just talking about typefaces in general, and then overall discussing kind of that world of fonts and what it means to work with a font and a typeface and how to make that work for embroidery as well. As I said, for people who are in the design world, why are there such differences? Why is matching and dealing with fonts for embroidery so difficult? So first, as you guys know, I always talk to the people who are live here first. So if you are here watching this on replay, feel free to fast forward if you want to. Otherwise, if you're here live, you know that I like to say hi to my live folks. If you're on the replay squad, happy to have you. Please comment anyway. Love to have your comments. Love to answer your questions as I can get to them. But for now, let's just say hi to the people who are here. I can see you guys are talking to each other, so I'll avoid some of that stuff. But we got Cindy saying good afternoon from out in Texas. Hopefully you are doing all right. I know you guys have been having some rough weather out there. We are just seeing the wind on my side over here in New Mexico, but not so much of what you guys have out in Texas. Hopefully you're doing all right. And we've got some other folks coming in. We got Barb coming in saying, hi, Eric. Good afternoon to everybody from North Central Minnesota. Happy to have you here, Barb, from Minnesota Custom Made. And we've got, like I said, Jab's talking in here. Cindy's talking. They're all talking to each other. Love that. We've got Frank from out in the UK saying, good evening, all. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being here, Frank. Marta's coming in from Texas. We've got lots of folks talking to each other. Brent saying hello from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Hey, Brent, happy to have you here. Doug is in as well. Hi, Doug. Happy to have you here too. Lisa Shaw, who knows all about talking with customizers. She is an awesome educator in the Brilliance frame, the Brilliance area again. And so love to see her here. And so good afternoon, Lisa. Thank you for being here. Ramona McKee, who's been actually always is a wonderful person to talk about these things too, both because she has her own show coming up on Saturdays and because she's deep in decoration and working on her process all the time. So Ramona, hi, happy to have you here as well. We have all sorts of lovely people. Maureen's coming in from Pennsylvania. Everybody's talking to each other. I love that. So thank you. And as Ramona said, not ugh again, but awesome again. It is for me. I'm going to say, frankly, I really love fonts. I really love typefaces. When I look even at the background, you guys know I've been putting the Wall of Shame background behind me for a while because I kind of like that one, the samples there. I'm looking and I'm like, oh man, I really do love this slab serif font on Alamo Navajo School Board back here. There's some custom lettering over here for VW Works. By the way, you guys have no idea how hard it is to point with the reverse camera on this thing. Deicides of Abyss up here, Los Salinas has some lovely type that's classic for motorcycles. It's very much kind of truthfully descended from 1800s wood type, the kind of stuff you see on a wanted poster, more like that. We've got some lovely stuff going on here, some really wild stuff from that fishing expedition. That's actually a movie prop. But you can see there's all of these different types. And you look behind me on this wall, we have custom type lettering, which is not really typeface. It's custom lettering, a lot of hand lettering that's being done. We have stuff that is styled. We like over here, this LRC that's over my shoulder. We can see that's, you can't see it from here, but it's got rivets and screws on it because it's supposed to look like a piece of machined metal. And it's kind of a varsity style, but it's very technical. We've got standard stuff that's on these patches, these kind of really lovely industrial fonts and Gothics that are going on here. Some sans serif stuff in very Euro style, that Cook County Sheriff there. Once again, another TV or movie prop. Can't remember which one that's from off the top of my head. But when we're dealing with embroidery, there's this world of typefaces and fonts. But there are some fonts that cause us some pain, especially when we're trying to deal with matching. And it's something that I actually have to deal with a lot, is people who are looking for fonts that match things that exist in the embroidery world. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is that matching. But like I said, there's lots to discuss. So if I should say embroidery fonts and typefaces, one of the reasons why we do have pain in embroidery fonts and typefaces is because we are coming from very different origins, right? So just to discuss what this is, difference between a font and typeface in general, we should understand a font as a collection of the art and spacing and everything, the technical package of all the things that are needed for us to use a typeface on a computer of some kind. So we're talking about a font in this case. We usually understand it as a font file. You're talking TrueType, OpenType, whatever that might be, WAF. I don't know if you're talking about web fonts. The font includes all of those glyph shapes. Maybe there's kerning tables involved. There's all of this, and that is a package of things that makes it able for you to do typesetting in your software on a computer, right? That's what that is. We're talking about embroidery fonts, and embroidery font isn't just the typeface. It is the collection of all the elements. If it's a native font, it's got all the digitized elements and shapes and settings that are required to generate everything that's there. So it's not just the shapes of the letters. It's the actual drawn shapes. For embroidery, we know that we're not talking about one single outline around each letter. We're talking about all of the little individual things we have to draw, the column stitches, even on a satin stitch normal font, the set of shapes that makes up each individual letter, and the extended part of that font is the technical stuff that it needs to generate. So in the case of embroidery fonts, many of them haven't had a very technical way of handling spacing. Some of them have font tables that are being imported from TrueType fonts that are used for the original setup. There's other ways that they can pull that kerning information, but a lot of those tools haven't been in embroidery software to create that. These things may change, and they may change soon, but there's usually not the same kind of access to the world of alternate characters and spacing and things that has been made available in the world of fonts, right? Of fonts for design and digital and print. Fonts for design, digital, and print have had some more technical abilities than the other ones have. Also, when we talk about fonts versus typefaces, a typeface is boiled down, and I am not using the best technical language here. Typeface, the way I'm trying to use this word today, that's us talking about these shapes. The style, the shapes of the type. So the thing is, the font also includes the name, the branding as it's being used, as well as the shapes and all the technical things, the spacing, the everything else that goes into making it able to generate in software. That's your font package. Typeface is, here is this set of drawn shapes that make up this typeface, this set of letters. They look like this. That's the typeface. So when I talk about typeface versus fonts, that's the first thing I want to let you know. When we're talking about the font, it's whatever it is, it needs to be for a software to make use of the letters that are there. So graphic software, TrueType, OpenType, we're very familiar with those. That is a vector-like shape. It's a vector shape, but it's not necessarily drawn with all the same tools that you would use for vector art, and it may not be in those formats, of course, but it is essentially a vector shape that is then usually describes the outside of that letter, the outside and any attending holes in that letter. And pretty much that's the information you're getting back out of it. Certainly spacing and all that can be utilized depending on the software, but it has outlines. An embroidery font, of course, includes not only that, but it has, at the very least, it's going to have a stitch type and stitch angles, as well as those outlines, entry and exit points, very likely branching groups, though the automation around embroidery fonts usually has a rebranch on native groups. So usually the connecting points of where you go in and exit a font and the sequence of stitching it will be altered by the font itself and closest point connection, because you can turn that on and off. But that is the thing. The font is a technical package of all the stuff it needs to generate. The typeface is the way it looks. And here's where we get some trouble. So why do we have trouble? Why are there some limitations? Why do people have issues? Yeah, that's the first set of issues, is font versus typeface. Typeface, just because a typeface exists and is a model, especially in the world of embroidery, doesn't mean that the embroidery is going to look identical to the typeface, especially because we are dealing with stitches. We are not trying to make it identical. We're trying to make it the best thing we can do according to the technical limitations of embroidery. So many designers are very frustrated because they're looking for a particular font, and what they're going to find out is when they go looking for this font or typeface, though they may even find something that someone has probably, against their better judgment, named exactly the same as the original typeface, because often that can be protected even if the shapes can't legally. And we can get a little into that, though I don't want to go heavy into copyright here, especially because it also varies from country to country. Even if it has the same name, even if it says it's the same weight, the likelihood that the embroidery font matches the graphical digital font that's being used is low. There's going to be alterations that are made, especially to deal with technical limitations, and either the absolute size or the fact that it needs to be scalable. So one of the top things I want to talk about when I said, hey, there's typefaces and there's fonts, there's problems with matching and mismatches. One of the largest problems is that in the transition from something that is meant for print that has, we are generally doing digital processes that have to our eye an almost infinite ability to scale. We're dropping tiny droplets of ink. We don't have the same limitations, even as we had with previous printing technologies. You don't necessarily have to make the massive changes based on scale that you do for embroidery. And embroidery being limited by the fact that we are absolutely jamming a needle thousands of times through a garment to make any line of text means that that physicality is going to cause us to change things due to those technical limitations, meaning that it's very hard to find perfect matches for things, and very often things have been altered. Also, the problem we have now is that many people looking for embroidery typefaces, they're looking to match something, and when they go to match it, the other problem we run into is that the origin isn't what they would expect. And what do I mean by that, right? I'm going to show examples and talk about more stuff as we get on, but I just want to define this quickly. This is the other problem folks have. If the typeface they're looking for, because this is the one thing, most of the time we're going from the design world into the embroidery world, where the problem is we can't find a match for this font that I have in the design world. Either nobody has gone to make it as a font for embroidery. So I am also going to talk about why we don't always want embroidered fonts, when we do and when we don't, in just a moment. It's something I've covered before, so I want to do that a little later. But usually it's coming from that design world. I have this font that somebody has specified. It's in a design document, and I can't find it in the embroidery world as something I can type as keyboard lettering, something that I can type in my embroidery software. That's the usual problem. The other problem I see going the opposite direction is that something may have been created for embroidery, particularly the things that were created early on for embroidery, that predate fonts as we know it, desktop publishing as we know it. They don't predate typefaces, obviously, because I mean, typeface and the idea of an uppercase, lowercase, and even the idea of a font, we are really talking about, you know, metal type and wood type. We're talking about old school printing press technologies. Obviously, it's not predating that. However, the commonly available master version of something that we expect from something that starts as a font, a digitally available true type font, there are embroidery lettering options. There are typefaces or lettering. You actually both, because it's the design is catered to embroidery. There are fonts, there are embroidery typefaces that were created before we had the access to fonts. We're talking about things created in the era of rub off letters. If you haven't seen it, there'll be a sheet of lettering, the letraset era, where you would take and lay down the sheet of lettering and rub off these wax letters, and you would do typeface that way and then reproduce it photographically. There is an era previous to fonts being available, previous to vector shapes, scalable being available to everybody, where fonts or typefaces were created, and they weren't really fonts because there's no software in that way, or they were done in different methods. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Created for embroidery, for the medium, and the shapes that exist are only there in embroidery. And now, even if you find them as embroidery fonts, we're usually bringing them in from the origin of a pre-embroidered sample or something that doesn't exist in any format that we can just pull in and convert as a font that we would expect for digital printing. So both, we have stuff that's previous to modern embroidery software, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. And we have hand-guided stuff where there's a general idea of what something looks like, but you may find that it varies quite a bit because it is maybe a hand-guided master. Then we have some more technology I'm going to show you in a minute, pantograph-guided masters. But all of these are really contingent on the embroidery technology of the time for looking the way that they do. And I'll show you some examples in just a second. But the other problem we have going back and forth from the design world to the embroidery world, or even trying to match a historical embroidery, and I'll say historical doesn't have to be that far back, right? We're not saying 300 years. We're talking about within the era of computerized embroidery, is that some of these typefaces, these fonts, are, if not lost to time, they have been usurped by others, or they have been isolated because they exist either on a tool or a machine that is not widely used, or in a software that we can't get them out from without recreation. And even then, they may be tied to the technology, because one of the ones I'm going to show you is definitely about the old Meistergram fonts. If you don't know what the Meistergram machines did, the original Meistergram machines, they actually stitched a zigzag, and you guided that zigzag around. So what they did is they had a kind of a single width zigzag that was always horizontal, and then we're guiding it around. But the stitch length is uniform, and the angle of the stitches is always horizontal. And there were fonts made for that don't translate to the modern way we do these things, and were originally semi-hand guided. So the problem we have with all of this stuff is that it feels like it should be one big library of all the fonts and typefaces in the world, and that they should be mutually intelligible. And those of us who come from an era, I come from kind of the Xennial era, where I'm like, all right, I'm an early millennial, late Gen Xer, depending on where you want to stick me in that box, right around that turn. When that happens, I saw a little bit of previous technology that was very analog, and I lived most of my life with the digital realities of current technology in one form or another. But that's the thing. If you come from any later than that, anybody who is younger than me, it's very likely that you've never done anything with type that isn't related directly to a font. And it feels like that is the original version of where type comes from. And there should be an original piece. There should be something we can go back to that is systematic and typable and convertible into different kinds of art. But that doesn't always exist. And so sometimes what we're doing, we're chasing these other versions. The other thing is something that I talk about all the time, which is lettering versus fonts, that there's also hand lettering that isn't a font, never was a font. And so when you look for a font to recreate it, even if it's based on one, there are lettering shapes that are not going to exist in some easy to type master. So before I get further into it, I'm going to show you some slides and show you some examples and talk about this a little more, but I've got comments here. So let me go with some of the comments that we have from folks and talk about it. Everybody's saying hi to each other, which is great. Okay, Doug's asked a question. I'm just going to say this is one of those it depends on what you're doing things, Doug. But he says, "Would love to know what underlay settings you like to use on sweatshirts. Doing a design font lowercase is 3/4. Depends on the width of the satin stitch. A lot of the time, I'm going to use an edge run underlay on this kind of stuff. Edge run or contour underlay. I usually set it off internally depending on how thick the sweatshirt is. I'm going to say zero point 0.6 to zero point 0.8 mils with a good bit of pull compensation, but it really depends on how that's set up in your software. And like I said, width of the column, and if we're seeing spacing, because sometimes if you're light on density, I'm going to increase underlay underneath it. You will see as we get wider and wider in the columns, I have a tendency to add zigzag or double zigzag over that edge run. But for most stuff where I'm going to see some grain like a sweatshirt, I'll probably do an edge run with some sort of other support if I can. But let's go with some other stuff that we've got on here. Lisa says, that's how I started newsprint ads using those sheets. Yeah, Letraset. Like I said, I've got this really interesting kind of space. When you're born around when I was born, and I was a really early adopter for technology. I went to an elementary school. I got bussed into an elementary school for gifted kids, but it then turned into a computer magnet school. And I used Max to do basic bitmap art stuff really young before it was available to everybody. We had some lovely people who helped and donated to our public school, and we had a computer lab that what I know now was alien for where I lived at the time. So it's like that. It was something where we were doing early design work and using the old school bitmap fonts, probably much younger than most people at my age. So I had that luck of getting to do that. Thank you. Steifelwaffle, maybe I'm right. Interesting stuff. Thank you for being on. And thank you for joining up on Twitch. Love to see people on Twitch. I still stream there, even though there's not a lot of folks there, but I love to see you there. Thank you for being here. Sarah says, it's a nightmare. Sometimes no matter what they want, that exact font, I've ended up digitizing the font or just doing the letters in a design. If it is a design. Now, okay, I didn't want to go here yet, but I'm going to do this first before I get to the examples, and I will show some stuff while I'm doing this. Let's talk about lettering versus fonts, lettering versus typeface. I'm going to bring up some slides. I know I've shown these before, but I think it's worthwhile to do. So let's pull this out and say lettering versus fonts, one of the things that I cover in my big lettering setup. This is where I'm going to talk about where the rubber meets the road on should we digitize or not real quick. Let's just go over it briefly. Lettering versus fonts, just to define one more time, especially when we're talking about like hand lettering. Lettering is, the way I'm defining it here, single purpose. It's a limited set of characters. It's idiosyncratic or unique. It can be contextual, so it fits into a space or is drawn for a specific area or has interactions with a logo. Logos and logo types and hand lettering are often lettering. What does this mean? These things are probably not located in a font anywhere. Even if it looks like a font, it may have been altered or it may have been drawn as inspired by that font, but you're not going to find the exact shapes anywhere. Fonts are multi-purpose, systematic, scalable, and universal. Generally, there's some wiggle room there, but generally that's what they are. Titles and text and personalization, that's where we want to use a font. Whenever there's something where we know we're going to change it repeatedly, we're going to use multiple lines of text, we're going to add or remove or change things in that text, that's where we want a font. If something is, and I'll just go ahead and say this out, certainly we'll go ahead and show you some more example stuff here. Once again, lettering versus font. Over here, the word logos here, and this that says hand lettered, and this is from House Industries, which, by the way, they make this lovely book for learning more about doing type. And I'm going to bring this up again, the lettering manual from House Industries, and I'll go ahead and put myself up on solo so you can see it. Lovely stuff in the lettering manual from House. It'll probably mess up my color balance, but they have really great ways of handling type and drawing type. So fantastic book. And yeah, I knew it was going to mess up my white balance, but I tried. There's some cool stuff about how you build fonts and stroke width, stuff like that. But yeah, the folks from House Industries made these images, so I'm going to go ahead and put those back up for you. Logos and lettering are often like what we see here on the left. This word logos, those two O's are different. Yes, open type fonts can have alternates, and now embroidery fonts, especially like in Brilliance, we have stylistic alternates that are really easy to select. I know other software has abilities to do alternate characters as well. Certainly ours, we have ones that are just art-based, that are stylistic. However, generally, you're seeing this kind of layout where these things are idiosyncratic. The placement is done. The spacing is very engineered, and it looks hand-drawn. We see the E's in lettered. All three of them are a little bit different, though they are obviously inspired by one typeface. This sort of stuff with logos, if you have anything that even smacks of this, That's a digitizing project that's custom. That you shouldn't be looking for a letter style for this generally. Yes, open type letters might have alternates, but if you start to see that there's 4 E's and every one of them is a little bit different, the high likelihood in this design is that it's going to have to be digitized manually. And also, if you have something for a logo, so let's say this is a logo type, it's not for personalization. It's not a name. It's not going to be changed. It's not going to be altered. You're not going to have to make various versions for all the different sports teams in the high school. And so each one has to have a different team name under there. If it is the logo for a company and it's a limited set of characters, most of the time you just want to digitize it. And that's from somebody who sells fonts. You know what I mean? I make fonts that people buy. So it's not like I don't have a vested interest. You would think I'm telling you go look for all the cool fonts. Yes, look for them for when they make sense. When you're digitizing a logo, it needs to match exactly to the logo. You don't use a close match unless you're going to alter those shapes, because a close match looks like a knockoff. If we went into the store and let's say we were high-minded, fashion-minded people, and we go to get a Louis Vuitton piece of equipment or gear or something or a bag, and we notice that the LV logo is close but not quite there, do we want to pay the same thousands of dollars for it? Absolutely not. It's not authentic. It looks like a knockoff. That's what we would think. Well, the same thing is true of our logos. If you're making a logo type for somebody, and especially if they have something where the number of characters is under 10, the number of unique letters, let's say that it isn't idiosyncratic, all the E's match, but you have no idea where that font comes from. If you've got less than 10 characters, it's really hard for me to argue that you should go looking for the font, because most of the time, unless you need it for titles or personalization or something else as well, you will save time if you're a digitizer, or if there's any other thing you're having digitized anyway. Even if you're having it done, you will save time and effort by either having it done or doing it yourself. Just draw the letters. If it is under like 10 unique characters, the time you spend searching for a font would probably be better spent digitizing it and letting it go. You would have to expect you're going to use it over and over again. But if we look at this art one more time, you can see these are similar kinds of fonts that are up here. You know, we have some swashy lettering. We've got some, kind of retro feel to it, but it's very obvious that what's on the right, the letters have some space and it's fairly, it's formulaic. It's made to make sense. It has different characters. It has all the characters you need for multiple languages, sometimes depending on the font. That's another thing between embroidery fonts and other kinds of typefaces. You frequently find embroidery fonts that are only made for personalization, and it will have like A to Z cap, A to Z lowercase, maybe punctuation and numbers. And that's not very common for fonts these days. Yes, some true type stuff, some stuff that's given away for free, that's given away by designers, might be really low character count, but the stuff that's sold by type houses usually has massive collections of glyphs. So glyphs being individual letters or symbols. Whereas embroidery fonts frequently don't have them. And so when you need those, you end up digitizing those too. Let's say you have an old school font that was made for largely, let's say it was made for an English speaking audience. Now, when you go to use that font for an audience with another language, you may find that those old school embroidery first fonts did not have any of the additional characters or accent marks that you might need. And so often when they're being updated, people who make these fonts for the modern world or trying to recreate them have to make all of those things, right? They have to create those things themselves. So that's the thing to kind of think about when we talk about this whole discussion of fonts versus typefaces and then the difficulty of going multimedia. Yes, we can get into technical limitations of embroidery. It's always there. It's kind of always haunting us that the smallest lettering is going to take a lot of work. And in fact, because of those technical limitations, certain kinds of design work just don't happen at certain sizes, not without a lot of compromise. So small, super ornate scripts, even super ornate black letter. So think Old English style fonts is the classic black letter you might know. Tiny calligraphic fonts that have spurs and lines and decorations, and they are illuminated. That's not happening at 0.2 of an inch. We're not going to get that out of a 5mm font, not without compromise, and little tiny scripts, not without compromise. So the technical limitations are always there. But the other thing that I have to keep on bringing to people's attention is not only do the origins of the font make a big difference as to whether it exists or not or can be found. But that also the whole lettering versus typeface issue. Sometimes the thing that they're trying to reproduce really is lettering. It's not a typeface at all. Tons of custom design work is this way. I consistently see people who see a stock embroidery design they love that has a word in it, but what they don't know is it was originally hand lettered art that someone digitized, and they want to put a different word. It says mom, but they're from the UK and they'd like to have mum instead of mom, and that U doesn't exist in the world because the person drew those letters by hand. Lots of brush scripts end up like that, where somebody has just done that work. You can find something similar, but if they really are down to the M's aren't exactly the same, the lines and the angles aren't exactly the same. Now we're into inventing stuff and we're into design, not even just digitizing. But with that, like I said, it's something that you have to think about. Yes, there's these differences between lettering and alternates and all these stuff that we talked about, but it is worth understanding that we do have different technical needs, but we also have different origins. And one of the things I wanted to show you very briefly is something that I know I've shown before. Meistergram machines is the one I just referenced a moment ago. The Meistergram machines that use the kind of that horizontal look to everything. And I want to see if I can bring up, I actually lost one of my graphics earlier. I had a crash and I lost something, but I'm going to try and grab something else because there are modern people making certain Meistergram type scripts and they're trying to do that work. And that's interesting. But it is something to understand that they do have a very unique look to them. And there's a reason for that. So what I'm going to do is pop up a graphic of like a machine being sold on eBay currently. I'm just going to bring that up and show it to you. And I've shown you these before, but it's kind of worth looking at the machine and understanding a little bit more about what we're looking at, right? So let's pull this up on screen. And this is what I'm talking about. You hear me talk about a Meistergram machine. Yes, there are modern embroidery machines that are under the Meistergram name, and those are not born of these limitations. So if you just go look up Meistergram embroidery machine, you may find a brand new modern multi-needle machine with a normal pantograph and everything you might expect from computerized embroidery. But I'm talking about something like this, right? The M100J is a monogramming embroidery machine that is semi-hand guided. And I'm going to show you what I mean by semi-hand guided. Yeah, we got all the parts. We have hoops. So we're looking like, okay, it looks like an embroidery machine. I feel like I understand what's going on here. The motors are the same, all this stuff. And then you go, oh, wait a minute. What's this table attachment with this slot? What is this for? So what this is for are these. And we see this case of type here. What are we looking at? Let's go ahead and bring up this graphic. And I think this graphic is worth looking at full size. What are these items we're looking at here? Well, these are our original Meistergram lettering sets. Now, what is this for? We have a pantograph, which has a marker on one side and it's attached to the hoop construction on the other side. And we are going to drop that little pin in one of these slots, and I'm going to trace this graphic with this big plate. Like I'm locking that plate down into the table. I'm going to trace this graphic manually. And as I do so, the machine you just saw is going to essentially put horizontal stitches in a zigzag at the same width throughout this piece. So though this piece kind of looks like, oh, it's going to have the same width and it's a same stroke width across it, as we get down into these curves, we can kind of see the curve that's going down at the bottom of this M. As we get down into those curves, when you go fully horizontal, if you were to travel exactly horizontal, it would be a stitch thick because the line is going to maintain that horizontal aspect throughout, right? And people have tried to make these for modern embroidery because you can absolutely do them with a modern machine. Here's one group that did it. Core, I know, made some Meistergram scripts. Unfortunately, they don't have any larger. I'm trying to open the image in another tab and see if I can get any more zoom out of it. I can't get much. What we can see, though, is if you see the stroke on the top of this 5 that's down here, if you see the bottom of the 2, what you're seeing there, and I'll try and get my pointer so I can actually just point at it a little more accurately here. When we're looking at these things, what we're seeing here is that single kind of width. So the vertical width of that line is essentially maybe a couple passes of thread across. It's very thin. Why is it very thin? Because we're dealing with essentially, we've got this set up where the horizontal stitches are just on that zigzag. We're not turning. There's at no point is the pantograph going back and forth the way it would do vertically in order to make a turning letter font, right? So that's a Meistergram style script. And you can understand it when you look at this. You're like, okay, I get it. If it's always going to be making these horizontal zigzag stitches the entire time that I'm running, and I'm guiding it through this pathway along this U, and I'm going up through the curve, every time I get to the tops of this curve, every time I get to the bottom of the bowl, the bottom here or over here, it's going to get thin and thick like a calligraphic pen. And so that's one of those times where the origin of the letter being embroidery first and being something that was on this zigzag machine is going to change the look really drastically. If you saw that example I showed you from Core, you can digitize them in such a way where you put blocks of, overlapped, essentially kind of overlapped, really tiny slices of satin. You try and make it look like that zigzag being overlapped and being very thin. And you can do that. Technically, it's not how a lot of modern embroidery fonts look, and they do suffer sometimes because of that super thin line. Or if you have any sort of horizontal grain or interaction with a fill that's too horizontal, you're more likely to have something kind of sink in if it's all just this really fine line that's there. Plus, that thick and thin may not be the look you're really looking for. You might want something more uniform, kind of like what it looks like those routed out panels look like. That's something you might look for. It really is. And actually, it's very calligraphic. Like I said, it's like a calligraphy pen. In fact, I just saw there's a comment in here from Brian Bailey, Creative and Brilliance. And he actually says very much the same thing as I said. It really is. It's zigzag calligraphy. If you had a horizontal pen that was exactly flat at 0 degrees and you drew with it a horizontal broad pen, that's what you would get from tracing through that, right? So if you were tracing through that, that's what it would look like. Interesting, right? Interesting, but at the same time, that is why when you try and find an original for that. So let's say you're someone who wants to make those fonts again. Maybe you're trying to match those fonts because they're out there in the wild. These things were used for years in, and not just the hand-guided versions. Eventually, Meistergram, before even they went to the fully computerized machines we have now that have modern setups and modern fonts and stitch angles that turn, they also had generations of machines that did the same thing but in an automated fashion, but they still had that very horizontal aspect. And those machines, the computerized versions, the hand-guided one I just showed you, were used for years and years and years in personalization. So if someone comes to you and they want to, here's the one that I hear all the time, I did throughout my career, they want to match a stocking. Well, it might be coming from a company that was using a Meistergram style machine. And even when they moved into more modern machines, they used a Meistergram style font. If you try and find the true type font for any of those, you won't. Unless it's been redrawn, there are a couple that are out there where someone has decided to draw the true type based on one of those old fonts for embroidery. And because they looked at either an original art source, so there are catalog books that used to come out with these things, or they found an art source for it, they may have redrawn that font into something that's close but is made for true type. Usually you're not going to love it because those super fine lines that are horizontal, if you try and turn your satin stitch into a super fine line, if you want a turning satin instead of to make these individual blocks of horizontal stitching like the zigzag would, when you go to turn or use automatic true type tools, now we're making a really, really fine, very narrow satin stitch in one angle, and then all the other angles are making this big fat wide one. So usually they've been redesigned, and that's kind of the thing that has to happen. But what that means is when people are looking for these either as embroidery fonts or if they're looking for them as true type fonts, they're usually stymied because they just don't exist. They existed as an emanation of the technology at the time. Now, I'm going to be the first to tell you that they are desirable because there's people out there who are still trying to match like generational sets of of other font stuff that's been personalized, sets of stockings, hats, bags, name patches that have been done with those machines forever. And then eventually we moved on to modern machines, but people wanted to match those things. There's enough of those out there that there's a desire for these fonts to exist. Up to the point that some of the custom stuff I've worked on over the years is to create things like this. And I'll actually show you something that's there may be a little hint about stuff you might see soon from me. Suffice it to say, however, these things have to be redrawn. There is no true type for most of these fonts. Not to mention, a lot of the monogram and embroidery fonts that we see out there, I'm going to tell you from personal experience and from hard-earned knowledge, they were drawn from original monogram books. And I don't have one, unfortunately, with me right now. I really should have brought one up. But there are monogram books from the 1800s. There are massive amounts from when embroidery, to when from embroidery hobbyists and people who were making monograms back in the day. There are tons of these embroidery books. That exist, that are out there, that don't have a digital original, that maybe have been scanned into libraries. And when someone made them for embroidery, they went directly from scans from these books from the 1800s, sometimes from these large monogram publications. And then they digitized those things and went over directly from there into the embroidery software. When they did that, what does that mean? Well, it means that the likelihood is that doesn't exist as any sort of digital version that you can find now. And because we know that native fonts don't really translate, they don't transfer back and forth, even the ones that are drawn in a vector style. And by the way, remember, original embroidered fonts were going to be punched stitch by stitch, not drawn in vector. So even if they're a digital format, they're likely a stitch file format that does not have an original piece to it. Old school embroidery, when it was punched, could be translated into a DST file or a stitch file, but doesn't have outlines, doesn't have a scalable version that was made with outlines that you could then export and change. They were just stitches at first. And even if someone did then do them in a modern software, there is the truth that art is generally locked into that software or that machine. So if it's made directly for a machine, it's very unlikely you're going to just find it as some sort of asset you can take and bring into your software unless somebody has taken the time to make it for that software. So like I said, technical limitations is usually what we talk about. Talk about underlay. We talk about size. We talk about how big a hole can be, how big a stroke needs to be in satin stitches for it to run. We talk about that all day long. Talk about scalability. If it's something where we want multiple sizes, it has to be in that native format. I need to have those vector style shapes, meaning that even if I had the stitch file, yes, there's scalable options. Embrilliance, especially we have Essentials, has a really fantastic stitch processing engine that does it, and other software like Wilcom will recognize it and try to make shapes for it, so then you can regenerate it from those shapes that it traces the outlines. It works great on some, bad on some. That's just one of those things that happens. You can have that limitation, but if you really want something that's superbly scalable and you want to do any kind of alteration of the outside lines that define each one of these strokes, you have to have those vector shapes, and they just kind of don't exist. So what does that mean? So once again, we're fonts versus typefaces. It means that though we may have typefaces out there and we want to match those, fonts may or may not exist. Prepackaged sets of assets that can be used and manipulated may not exist. And it requires somebody to kind of bloody-mindedly redraw them. You're going to ask me how I know that. Let me tell you how I know that. I know that because I've done it several times. When there is something historical that's worth saving, that's out there and people are looking for it, or that is locked to a specific old school software or a machine, something that we can't get it back out, that's something that I'm kind of passionate about bringing forward, because I think a lot of these old school typefaces, if we can call them typefaces, really deserve to be brought forward. And some of them are quite beautiful and really should be made something that we can do all the work we expect to do with them, even if it's not something that exists right now. So like I said, I've got some examples of that I'm going to try and show you. I had some other stuff. Hopefully if I can find one of my other things. I forgot to grab a scan of my original kind of 1800 stuff that I was talking about, and I may have to come back and show you guys that later. But I will try and grab one if I can grab one while we're working. But if not, I do want to show you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about and why sometimes it can be difficult. Because the other thing is, when we're working with certain kinds of type for embroidery, we have to recommend to people that, yes, though they exist, there's going to be some technical stuff we have to do to serve embroidery. It's not only technical limitations, but it's just the way embroidery works. So it's not necessarily a limitation, but like if you're working with scripts, we know if we want to do scripts from left to right, we might have things that are under or over that look weird, like strokes that go under another or over another. And the spacing can be hard to work out unless you have tools for that. And not all software and not all fonts are made with tools that support that. So you might have to do a lot of editing or work on your own unless it's been made to handle those problems. But let me show you some stuff. You guys have seen some of the other stuff I've done. I'm going to talk about embroidered typefaces briefly and just kind of show it. But let me show you a couple of things that in software, and we can talk about them, and some example stuff like I was discussing. First, you guys know I just did the Ace 1 package over at Embrilliance where we talked about all those retro fonts. And just to kind of show you, like I said, sometimes there's a limited character set. And this is one of the Ace 1 fonts. Because the Ace fonts stand for all caps enveloping, they're made to hug an envelope. If you guys haven't seen that, I will briefly bring up an envelope and show you what I'm talking about. They're made to hug an envelope and work specifically in that fashion, right? So I'll bring one of these up and just kind of show you. We've got some different enveloping styles, but if we look at Ace 1 to Rewind, we'll bring that up. This is what I'm talking about with all caps enveloping. They're made to hug a shape very specifically, and we've got some different ones here. You can see this one is Lagrange, which looks like this when you use it in envelopes. I'm just showing you the different envelopes that are there. But that's why it's in all caps. It's not because I didn't want to do the rest of the set. It's because the lowercase and uppercase don't really work for the process. It's something that we wanted to think about. However, you can see that even this set, even though it's a limited character set, you'll often see embroidery fonts that only have caps A to Z and digits, and will have a little bit of limited punctuation. But what I'm going to tell you is, if you look at this set, there are things in this set that didn't exist. Lots of folks like to put up their Instagram handles with stuff, so I created an @ sign that kind of matches. Is it perfect? No, but I made one that matches the style so that if somebody wanted it to fit with the style and have it the height of those envelopes, it would work. Sometimes we're forced to invent stuff for that, and honestly, this is not my biggest design triumph. I've done better on other fonts, I think, but it's not bad, right? Sometimes you have to deal with the limitation of the space as well as the technical limitations. But you can see, as I tend to do, I will add at the very least a limited additional character set. In this case, we've got AE ligatures, OE ligatures, Enye, the various accented vowels that are usually common for most Euro and Scandinavian languages. And we have some German stuff. We have like the Est set here. And also for the Scandinavians, I've got my thorn and my eth. So soft and hard TH, depending on what language you're in. We've got some of those added because we have those people who are really in our target market who like to use these. But it's not everything. It's not a massive character set, but it is pretty big. The thing is, when we look at these, or when you look at any of those font sets, these are fairly limited, but they have a specific use. This is a more common kind of set that you might see from a lot of embroidery fonts, especially the old school ones. You're going to see a limited character set. However, sometimes you end up in a much deeper character set. I'm going to show you something that I've created that you may see again later. For right now, you're just seeing it as a hint. This is a lovely little script that I'm referring to here as connected script. Name may or may not be that when you see it again sometime, but I'm going to show you some of the complications that come up. This is from an original. This was a Meistergram style font. So it does have the thicks and thins of a Meistergram style font. However, when you zoom in close to this piece, there was no original. There is no true type for this. There is no original set of art aside from looking at the original fonts as they were used and the samples that were used for selling these fonts. But you can see that we do have a fairly universal language of design for these. We have thicks and thins pretty well defined, but you can still see the hallmarks of that old school look. Why did I go ahead and recreate this piece? This is one of the ones that you see on Christmas stockings everywhere, and it was used by a lot of high-end companies. I think Pottery Barn is one of them. There's multiple ones like that where they wanted to continue using these old school fonts, and we have generations of people trying to match something from this, either apparel or linens or something else like that. They're trying to match it. I've made individual names in this font previous to making this as a font in this typeface. But now what we have is a complete set. But what I'm going to show you is how these things kind of spin out on you when you're making them for reuse. First thing you're going to find out is that there are weird idiosyncratic characters that were made in these fonts. If you look here, this D, really idiosyncratic. It looks shorter than the other capital letters, but this D is what it looked like in the original pieces. That's what the original pieces looked like when they were first being used. That D, this F with a really low crossbar, this is what was in the original typeface set. The problem is when you release this to a modern audience, this D, this F, and sometimes the I's and J's, sometimes the T's, depending on how they're formed, really don't hit with a modern audience. They don't read as the letters that they should. So then if you're someone like me, you might stop and say, all right, well, then I need a D that looks more like a modern D and is full height. I need an F with a crossbar that looks like the crossbars from the other letters, like the E that happens to have a serif on it. But for some reason, the F does not. It looks more like a swoosh connector and not like a serif middle crossbar. And you'll see that I've got alternates for the M. Why? Well, if we look at the original M, let's zoom back out. The M doesn't match the N, whereas most modern script typefaces that look similar to this don't have an M with a lead in. They would have both the M and the N have that same curly Q lead in at the top. So what do? I've made my own M here. So there's a stylistic alternate. The other kind of stuff you run into, especially with script fonts, is connectors. The original font, somebody was hand guiding it and made sure everything connected exactly. So in reproducing it, you have to maintain an even connector height and length. And even then, depending on the software you're in and the tools that are available, they may not connect automatically. Now, we're working on some stuff where they might be a little better than that. At the same time, that's not universal. So what you may find when you're doing these, even if you find a font that works for you, there's a high likelihood you'll be tweaking spacing a little bit. Though all designers are going to try, if they can, with either kerning pairs or by using manual tools in their software to make these things match up better, they will. But it's not something that's in every font. What you will see, though, if you look at the S, we have an old school calligraphic, very cursive styled S that's here. This is what's in the original font. However, if you look at it, let's imagine this R and S together. And I don't have to imagine, I can show you what we're talking about. If you drag the R and the S together as they are, well, what you're going to get is something pretty weird. You're going to get a weird little angle here and a nub here, because what really needs to happen is this needs to trail up directly into that S, and we need to have something where there isn't a leading stroke. Problem being is when we have this as after an apostrophe or with a space in it, or if we have something that starts with a lowercase, that leading stroke makes it look more like the S that we expect. So what do I have to do to make that work? Well, I have to make a version of the S that's an alternate so that I can have a tail stroke from the previous letter roll into it. Now multiply that and add all the accents in, and this is just a fraction. If you look at modern OpenType or TrueType fonts, this is just one section of many. And of course, you have to do things like, let me tell you for sure, the original set from this font did not have an AE ligature, an S set from German, a thorn set, upper and lower case, an ash, like I said, they did not have these things. Thorns and eths and all these things. There's our set of eths, the D with the cross. Those things did not exist in the original font. So if you want to create those for yourself, and also this @ sign, which by the way, I added very late in the process because I just didn't notice it was missing one. They have to be drawn whole cloth. You have to look at the font as it is and then figure out what it's going to be when you're done. In fact, I believe this one also did not have an ampersand, and I decided to go with the ET style ampersand, kind of an old school typeface trick to use the ET, which is the original kind of Latin ligature that gives us the ampersand. That's what that is, ET. That's et. So we got some Latin class as well. These are things that you do. You look at these systems and work on them, or you'll find fonts that are from other old school softwares, and you just have to work them out. And you'll find that they have little idiosyncrasies. And I'll just show you. I'm going to zoom in on this one. Here's another one similar that has to be worked out. And in the final kind of cleanup phase, you're going to see that I've got some example line art behind this piece. Those are from the original. The problem is the original font, when it was made, was not very systematically created, and we had various capital heights, and it wasn't stylistic. It was something where it was from an original hand-guided font, and they copied what was there in the original materials, but a modern user likes to have top lines and base lines that line up, even on script fonts, and especially one like this where it is pretty systematic. You'll find that it shouldn't have a really short S, a really short T in the line, because it's very obvious when you do, let's say, a first and a last name. So these are things that have to be done to make these things modern. And as with the previous, you better believe there are no ashes, there are no thorns, there are no OE ligatures, S sets, and signs. Often you will also find no dollar signs, no punctuation. This one had a dollar sign that was very hard for it to sew at the sizes of everything else, so I did some work on it. And there was also various angles and other problems here. You'll also see that I've already started to include some stylistic alternates for things that are not that don't make a ton of sense, that might have just been idiosyncratic choices by the original creators that don't look like a typeface, that don't look like the modern typefaces we expect. So that's the thing. When you're dealing with embroidery fonts, the thing to kind of remember is these things all have an origin, and it can be in dealing with fonts like I showed you there, where we have these typefaces that don't exist outside of historical examples of the embroidery itself. It can be that we're dealing with, like I said, the lettering versus font problem, where if it's hand lettering, there is no font to go from. More often these days, even with a lot of hand lettering, somebody is looking at a master or may have grabbed a font, used it, and altered certain characters or used alternates that are existing in the font. It's more likely to find now, but I'm going to tell you, large companies often just have these things hand drawn. Even when they are based on a font, the designer is making stylistic choices and changes. And that origin means you're not going to be able to just pick up a keyboard font and type. Should that make you feel terrible about this or think it's just impossible? Absolutely not. What I will say is, though I tell you frequently when we're talking about the problems with matching that you shouldn't use a nearest match for something in a logo, like if we're inside a logo, we have these things we're seeing behind me here. We've got our VW Works. I shouldn't just go find a script that's close and put it on the VW Works logo. That big piece of jacket-back art, it deserves to have the font that it was intended to, and it was hand-drawn by somebody. It was not done with a font. However, if they decide that, let's say they've opened up 5 units, 5 locations of VW Works, and they're in all sorts of different states that have to have the city name and the state name and something else underneath it, somewhere under this logo. If I find something that is a stylistic match that they like, that's fine. Then it's okay to go ahead and I'm going to say, I need to have a keyboard font that you can use. Here are some options that I think really go well with your type. In fact, I would say you don't generally want to match logo types in this case. Usually, if it's somebody who's large and corporate, they'll have other types that go with it. Or you look for good pairs that are things that pair with a similar script. There's tons of websites out there that show font pairings. And if nothing else, grab all the keyboard fonts you have, bring a logo in, and then type a bunch of lines that are examples of what you would do. Pick one of the most popular cities in the states that you're putting under this logo, type that all in, show them an example contact sheet that has the logo type on it and then it has that type on it, and show them some pairings that might work. Because if it's something where we are going to keep retyping multiple different texts to it, if it's divisions, if it's names, whatever it is, then we do need a keyboardable font. Then it makes sense. Then we know we want a font, a typeface, something systematic. We need to have something we can type in, and that makes sense. When it's something where it's fully custom, looking for a font for ages to try and make that happen is not really all that useful. However, there still are people who are looking to kind of help us, like I've done and like many others have done. I showed you other examples of people doing it with those original fonts that were made for embroidery. They exist. They can be hard to find. If it is really important to you, looking for it can be something useful. One of the versions I showed you is something that's used by a large club that's something that's in schools, and they require this font. The problem is it only exists in some software and not in others. There are other pieces where the origin is a set of font. There's a set of fonts that has been out there and relicensed forever that are in lots of embroidery software, but you're going to find that many different pieces of embroidery software have decided to work on them to get past technical limitations, to make some clarity edits, or because the original formats they were given were not in the kind of condition that they look like, as I showed previously, what a modern font is expected to look like and what it's expected to be able to do. So those kinds of things. Back in a day where it was much more acceptable to assume everyone is going to be able to do all their kerning manually or be willing to, then that's something. Otherwise, don't get me wrong. There are people working on it. We're working on it. We're working on groupings and trying to make it automatically type out where all the different various characters line up exactly, where we use signifiers to help us get exact alignments on things so that we can kind of work on these pieces and have them turn out the way we expect, so that when you dump in someone's name, as you see here with my own, that you get this off the bat. What I'm going to say is, with script fonts, that may or may not happen depending on your software or the font itself, and that's okay. We have to understand that with the limitations of embroidery and the things we have to do to make them work, it's really common, really, really common, that you're going to have to do a little bit of manual work. Um, Luckily, there are some of us out here trying to recreate some of these things and bring them into the modern era. Also, trying to bring you new and popular fonts, like the stuff from Ace One. Even though it's a retro font set, there's a ton of those fonts that we worked on where it just doesn't exist in the kind of canon of what's good for embroidery. And even when we make them, like I'll bring the font back up that I was talking about a moment ago, Tannerite, which is one of the ones that's in the Ace collection. What I'm going to show to you versus what was there, I'm just going to let you know, when you look at this font, Tannerite, the original shapes from which I was working, and I actually worked with more than one typeface on this one to get concepts for what it was supposed to look like. These shapes have been redrawn to suit embroidery. And if you go and find the original open type fonts or true type fonts, and honestly, the original contact sheets that were from the retro fonts that look like this, that are not digitally available, or at least not in their existing form that is on those contact sheets, you'll see massive differences between my version that I finally ended up with in order to serve embroidery and the versions that are out there for print. Much tighter apertures, much larger variation in thick and thin lines because they were not trying to suit the embroidery. So when you even find them, like I said previously, if you're trying to make a design font into something for embroidery, you're very likely to make changes to it. If you are trying to get this as a typeface, if you're trying to match an exact typeface to a print piece, you're also going to find yourself in a similar boat where you're going to be matching close as you can. You're not likely to find this exactly. Why? This was created very much like the old school fonts were, the ones that I've showed you previously, for embroidery, with embroidery in mind from the get. It was made as an embroidery typeface. It was not intended to be for print first. So I think that's where we're going to leave most of this today. I think I'm going to talk to some people here, but it's one of those things that I will return to because number one, it's a great passion of mine. Number two, it's something I'm working on a lot, but it's worth understanding what's going on with these fonts. Certainly, if you guys have questions about fonts or typography or embroidered fonts or the material that we use to make them, we can talk about that as well. I would love to be able to bring you some of the stuff that I've done previously. And I will discuss with you how it looks like to be taking these things from the manuals, the old school 1800 stuff. There's lots of this material that's out there. But the thing to understand is we're bridging a gap, right? In this world, when we're doing this for embroidery fonts and typefaces, we're bridging this gap. And in fact, we're bridging a couple different gaps. There are gaps in time. So time and technology, even in the world of print fonts, you are going from a time of metal type or wood type, depending on where and when you're from and what you're looking at, into a world of digital type. And that's the first kind of disconnect where you may not have all these exact examples, and you very likely don't have full massive character sets like you do in the modern world of digital type. And then we're bridging the more important gap for us, which is from any kind of print typeface into the world of embroidery, where we know, especially when we're talking about like satin stitch fonts, there are these limitations for the smallest hole we can make, the thinnest stroke we can make. Honestly, how many stitches can we pile into a tight corner? So thick and thin lines coming together have to be altered. The way that shapes flow, the way that stitches work. So in bridging all these gaps, what do we end up with? Honestly, we have to just work the process. What does this mean? If we have few enough letters in a typeface, like I said, if it's a lettering versus typeface and it's hand lettering, it's lettering. It is a type, it is not something we're going to reproduce over and over again and do different type in it. Digitize custom with the technical limitations in mind, make the changes you have to make, but understand that some things just need to be made. But when we need a font, when we are replacing something and we are doing personalization, when we are matching, it is not a bad idea to search for it, especially if it's something we're going to use over and over and over again. If you're someone who's in the business of monogramming, or if you're somebody in the business of doing personalization and you're getting stockings every year, those of you who know what this is are going to be asking me when you can get your hands on it, because you know the pain of having to look for this sucker because it doesn't exist. That's fine. Then it makes sense to start searching for fonts and to look for software or look for tools that allow you to use the fonts that you're going to use in your work. Same thing for monogrammers. There are specific monogram fonts that people really want. When you get those fonts, it's worth searching for those sometimes, because especially with things that are highly based on current popularity, fonts come in and out of fashion, but then we also have some of these fonts like the ones I just showed you that I won't call them eternal or necessarily evergreen, but especially when they are linked to long-standing brands, long-standing traditions, clubs that go back for decades and decades and decades, the chances are people are going to want to continue to use them. And I'll say that's been my experience. The Meistergram fonts, especially, I have had many times that I had to go back and do closest match work or digitizing work on these fonts because so many uniform shops and sportswear companies and like I said, high-end decorators that did personalization from back in the day. So many people have used these fonts over time and have these legacy fonts embedded in their culture that they keep coming back. And it's really useful to have those in a way that we can use them on a modern tool with modern templating, with modern envelopes and baselines and all the stuff that makes life easier as a personalizer, right? As someone who is going to continually make different names, different type setups in software and have to get those to run out reliably. So, like I said, there's some stuff that's worthwhile. There's some stuff that you might want to use. And it's worth looking from when they do have that kind of agelessness, or if it really is something that is popular and hitting the current consciousness. That's kind of what Ace One was. It was hitting a current consciousness. And honestly, being that I can't turn on the local news without seeing somebody with a t-shirt with wavy retro type on it, you can't escape it. I think I hit it at least close enough that it's still in the public consciousness for everybody to enjoy Ace One. But at the same time, I will say if it was for a logo for a company with 4 unique characters in their name, if I have to make the name Walt and I'm only ever doing it once, I'm digitizing those 4 letters. I'm probably not looking for a font to do it, unless I want the rest of Walt's team to also be paying up the next time they go get shirts. The thing is, you got to know what your exposure is, and certainly look for the people who are making those things that are useful to you, and definitely get those things as well. So, we'll have to see. Suffice it to say, if you have fonts like this, hey, tell me. I might be one of the people making those. You never know. If you have things that you're looking for, I'd love to hear about them. Tell me your stories about what kind of fonts and personalization you do and where your heartache is. I know, like I said, mine has always been in matching. The biggest one is always Christmas stockings. Christmas stockings. And funny enough, I had a lot of cheerwear where the company that was very popular in my location was using an old school Meistergram, and I had to go find all those Meistergram fonts and make my own originals for some of that stuff. But that's something that's worthwhile knowing. Know what the typefaces are. Understand that embroidery is its own animal. Know that the origins of the typeface might be why you're constantly getting stymied. And also know when to throw in the towel. When there is something that is just immediately obvious that it is not a font system that's systematic, digitize, have it digitized, especially inside of a logo. Don't do closest match. Don't make it look like a knockoff. But when you need that system that's going to be there for you, that's when it's worthwhile to invest in that system, because it's something that's going to be kind of continually bearing fruit as especially those beloved fonts that are consistently coming up. All right, folks. So enough font talk, enough talking about like typefaces and stuff like that. I love to nerd out about it, but I'm gonna let you go for now. If you have questions, if you have comments, go ahead and leave them here. But I cannot wait to come back again next week, and hopefully we'll hear back from some of you guys about what you want to learn. But suffice it to say, everyone will get stitches again next week.